Good afternoon, evening, everyone. I am Tanya Rana. I'm a researcher at the Accountability Initiative of the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. My colleagues Ritvik Shukla and Avni Kapoor and I co-wrote this paper on needs analysis for women's safety schemes in public spaces in India, where we look at how many facilities it will take and how much it will cost to provide shelter facilities to victims of violence in public spaces in India. I look forward to our discussion and also your suggestions to taking this work forward. So to set out a brief context, and before diving into the core of this paper, it is important to think about how violence against women in India manifests and how it is also recorded. Firstly, violence is an overlapping phenomenon, which implies that one form of violence does not preclude another kind of violence. For example, sexual violence can also occur with emotional violence. Secondly, and this is also relevant to our paper's methodology, which is that violence against women is different from crime against women or reported cases of violence, as per the Crime in India report of National Crime Records Bureau. So violence against women is an instance of violence, and crime against women is when that instance of violence gets reported. So violence against women, as I also said before, it's interrelated, it's broader. In fact, some estimates suggest that as many as 99% cases of sexual violence in India go unreported. And thirdly, because violence is not reported, it can prevent redressal through existing formal channels. This might happen because women may themselves be unaware of these sites. So for example, a World Bank survey from last year said that over 75% of women commuters in Bombay were not aware of the women helpline number. Redressal might also not happen because of low faith in justice system. Something that Sarojini ma'am also mentioned during her presentation is that it can take anywhere between 2 to 28 days in Uttar Pradesh for a woman to file an FIR of violence against her. And it can also be because victims or survivors of violence might not have any alternate support system, forcing them to go back to their perpetrators. So all of this combined contributes to underreporting of violence against women. So what were the objectives of our paper? Why did we do this needs analysis for women's safety schemes in India? We wanted to estimate the number of victims of violence given underreporting in crimes and the facilities needed to accommodate these victims. We also wanted to determine the costs for financing these facilities through two women's safety schemes called the One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan of the Ministry of Women and Child Development for the financial year of 21-22. Once we determined these costs, we compared it to the latest budgetary allocations for these two schemes. So the usefulness of such a costing exercise that it tells us the gaps in financing, and at the same time it can progressively allow policymakers to better plan and budget for such government schemes. So the next obvious question becomes, why did we only choose One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan? But before I get into that, I want to briefly mention the scheme reclassification exercise that the Ministry of Women and Child Development undertook in 21-22 for its schemes of safety and empowerment of women. So the Mission for Protection and Empowerment of Women was reclassified into the Mission Shakti in 21-22. And this Mission Shakti was further divided into the sub-scheme of Sambal for safety and security and Samarthya for empowerment of women. So several schemes like Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, Working Women Hostel, PMMVY, Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana, which is a maternity benefit scheme, they all existed as standalone schemes before being clubbed into these broad sub-schemes. And what this resulted in is that now we don't have standalone budgetary allocations for them. They're all clubbed under Sambal and Samartha. So we don't know how much money these schemes individually get. So as you can see on your screens, One Stop Center is a part of Sambal and Shakti Sadan is a part of Samarthya. So now coming back to our question on why One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan, we selected these schemes as they provide similar kinds of services to survivors of violence. These schemes provide rescue and redressal services by providing shelter facilities and medical or legal assistance, etc. to them. And these two schemes operate after the incidents of violence. And by doing this, we have, in our way, attempted to contribute to the broader literature on women's access to public spaces and the state's role in making these spaces accessible for them. In fact, these two schemes also have a common pool of resources for legal aid and psychosocial counseling, and victims can choose to go to either of these facilities. The difference, however, in terms of the number of days of redressal provision. So, for example, the OSC, a victim can take shelter in an OSC for not more than 5 days. In the case of Shakti Sadan, a victim can stay for a maximum period of 3 years, but there is a limit to how many victims can access this space. Only 50 victims per Shakti Sadan, and this is something that we will come to when we discuss the methodology of our paper and the way that we arrived at our costing estimates. Okay, so of course there are implementation challenges with which people have studied before for these shelter facilities. So reports suggest that several women lack awareness about the location of a one-stop center in their district, for example. Vacancies of staff like psychosocial counselors or even lacking medical supplies at such facilities can impact redressal of services. Another important reason for lacking implementation is because of inadequate finances, as you can see on the figure towards your right. So utilization of allocated monies has only decreased for all these three schemes since 2018-19 to 2021. In fact, if you see, OSC presents a very interesting situation in which utilizations for 2018-19 were far greater than the allocations made. But in 2020-21, even though allocations were much higher than those in 2018-19, utilizations were only 42% of those allocations. So what this says is clearly there was a demand for the scheme. We can see that it happened in 2018-19, but that demand progressively, it's subdued for XYZ reasons, and we can see that in how the monies were allocated.
Ujjwala is that gas cylinder?
No. Ujjwala this was a scheme for trafficking of victims. This is an MWCD scheme. No, it's a union scheme. Yeah, it used to be. So Swadhar Greh and Ujjwala were merged. No. That is Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana. It's a part of Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gases scheme. So that's a subsidy, fuel subsidy scheme.
Yeah, but OSC money came, some of it from the net gas.
Yes, it did.
I want to make that thing because they didn't have to make an allocation.
Yeah, but the allocations were
No, they are
shown
made
separately.
annually,
Yeah.
But they already had a pot of funds.
Yes. All right, so coming to the methodology of our paper. So we started off by describing these schemes and selecting gender-based violence victims in public spaces as per NCRB's data from 2021. Then we used MWCD's reported data on the victims who sought redressal under both these schemes in 2021. For Shakti Sadan, we combined MWCD's reported data for Swadhar Greh and Ujjwala because Shakti Sadan only came about recently when Swadhar Greh and Ujjwala were merged. And then we calculated proportion of women seeking redressal under these two schemes and used that estimate to see how many women will need each of these schemes. And then we followed this up by using different levels of percentage of underreporting to see the extent to which MWCD missed providing these facilities to women. There is no clear evidence on one number of underreporting, and that is why we used a range. While doing this, we added another variable. It was National Family Health Survey's wealth quintile data to consider only those women who may need these schemes in the least wealthy households. This, of course, is due to the assumption that women in higher wealth quintiles have better access to institutions of justice because of favorable geographical, social, and economic conditions. And at the same time, this data assumes that decision-making of household finances, women also play an equal part in household finances decision-making, which cannot be true or may not be true. And then we looked at the unit costs, which were mentioned in the scheme guidelines for both of these schemes. And lastly, we estimated needs for the facilities that were required using figures that we calculated for the estimated victims. And then we also calculated the to-be constructed facilities, which is nothing but the difference between these required facilities versus existing facilities. So for example, if we require 5 facilities, but there are only 3 facilities that exist for an OSC or a Shakti Sadan, there would be 2 more facilities that would have to be constructed in that state. And then we multiply this by the unit cost that we calculated through the scheme guidelines and came up with an overall cost for scheme provision under One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan for the financial year 21-22. Now, the limitations of our paper. Two broad limitations in the study as per scheme-related services and available data. For scheme-related services, we have assumed that MWC reported victims in 2021 are over 18 years of age. Scheme benefits, however, are also extended to girls, but since the data is not disaggregated by age, it was difficult for us to determine how many of them might be girls. So we went through with this assumption that they were over 18 years of age. Secondly, we cannot say that women may be availing all of the facilities from legal to shelter to taking medical help at the One Stop Center or Shakti Sadan. For example, women may only be seeking counseling services and not really the shelter facility. There are data constraints too. We have assumed unit costs for all states and UTs to be the same because states do not come out with their own unit costs. It's also a union level scheme, so they technically cannot. Several states and union territories also do not report their releases and utilizations, because of which we could not compare budgetary allocations state-wise for all these schemes. Using NCRB data also presented an interesting statistical limitation in the way that crime against women data is collected in India. So NCRB follows the principal offense rule, and as per this rule, crime is reported as per the maximum penalty under the Indian Penal Code. So for example, dowry death attracts a greater penalty than cruelty by husbands or relatives. And all of this contributes to underestimating needs and progressively costs. Lastly, we have assumed the same level of underreporting for all crime against women in public spaces for this study, which may not be true. It is not necessary that kidnapping would be similarly underreported as sexual violence, for example. Now I'd like to take you through some of our key findings. So as per this graph, on the x-axis, we have different levels of underreporting. So you can see different levels of underreporting from 1% all the way to 49 to 50%. And on the y-axis, we have estimated victims under One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan. So two key points to note here. Estimated victims in the bottom wealth quintiles. I'd mentioned that we added this variable of women needing assistance only in the least wealthy households. In this case, we also considered rural households. So estimated victims in the bottom wealth quintiles are directly proportional to the rate of underreporting. So there are more victims or survivors of violence as there is an increase in the rate of underreporting. And the number of estimated victims under OSC, One Stop Center, are far greater than Shakti Sadan. This could be because MWCD also ended up reporting more survivors going to an OSC, which was over 1.5 lakh in 21-22, and only over 10,000, precisely 9,792 victims in the case of Shakti Sadan for 21-22. And this pattern might also exist because there are more existing OSC facilities. This could also mean that women are demanding shorter term stay than a longer term stay, which a Shakti Sadan provides. But there is no evidence to suggest one or the other. So if we only look at underreporting of crime against women at over 50% and consider only women in the bottom wealth quintile in rural areas, we find that One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan missed more than 3.5 lakh and over 50,000 victims of violence under One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan respectively in 2021. I will repeat this. One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan missed more than 3.5 lakh and over 50,000 victims of violence in 2021. For representation purposes again, this figure shows two levels of underreporting, one at 30%, which we have considered as a minimum level of underreporting, and another at 90%, which is maximum underreporting. And in both cases, we have estimated victims in the bottom three wealth quintiles as per the National Family Health Survey. So looking specifically at One Stop Center state-wise, we see the highest difference between women covered by MWCD and women who may have needed assistance in Uttar Pradesh, followed by Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. In fact, Uttar Pradesh also recorded, I think, over 13% of overall crime against women in India as per the latest NCRB figures, which is the highest. So according to Women and Child Development Ministry's recent guidelines on Mission Shakti, 300 new one-stop centers are to be constructed in the coming years. Based on our estimations, at the minimum, over 202 facilities need to be constructed, but at the maximum level of underreporting, MWCD will have to construct as many as 13,459 facilities. And this is clearly nowhere close to the 300 figure mark. Coming to Shakti Sadan, we see that the highest gap exists for West Bengal, Odisha, and Karnataka. Unlike one-stop centers, Shakti Sadan's needs for facilities are far greater than one-stop centers. The number of facilities that need to be constructed, even at a minimum level of 30% of underreporting for women, is 573, which is far more than the number of existing facilities. One reason for such high needs might also be because several states have never built a Shakti Sadan. Bihar and Haryana, for example, do not have a Shakti Sadan. West Bengal, in fact, does not have a one-stop center. Now, since Shakti Sadan is meant for long-term redressal, whereas one-stop center is for short-term, for only 5 days, victims do not have a choice to seek shelter in either of these facilities nearby. And this has the potential to undermine needs. So broadly, the trends in estimated victims and facilities suggest that a greater number of victims are going to one-stop center than Shakti Sadan. One reason could be, as I said, greater number of one-stop centers than Shakti Sadans. But what can this also imply based on existing literature? So studies have suggested that this might point to women's low propensity to seek some, low, or no redressal against violence against them. Women tend to go back to abusive households because of lacking alternate support, which we know prompts underreporting too. So they might be seeking quick redressal, if any, through one-stop centers. And since one-stop centers only allow for a 5-day stay or redressal period, it is interesting to see that our findings do reflect some of what the existing literature corresponds to. Looking at some comparing union budgetary allocations with our costs, so we looked at allocations from 2020-21 because standalone allocations were not reported after 21-22 since the schemes were merged. We combined allocations for Swadhargriha and Ujjwala again to compare it with costs for Shakti Sadan. And overwhelmingly, generally, this table shows that the costs for required and to-be constructed facilities are much greater than the allocations made. At higher levels of underreporting, they're even greater. Okay, conclusion and way forward. So the immediate conclusion of our finding is that MWCD has underestimated needs and finances for one-stop center and Shakti Sadan for financial year 21-22. And what does this majorly imply? The lack of adequate one-stop centers and Shakti Sadans suggests that victims are not being able to seek redressal through these government schemes. In a situation where one-stop centers are constrained with low accessibility and awareness, most victims trying to seek support through these shelters are probably not receiving it. Low redressal correspondingly leads to a situation of low spending and even lower allocations progressively because governments have competing priorities. And governments will not increase allocations if in a situation of limited absorptive capacity. So if you think of the figure that I'd shown originally, how utilizations for one-stop centers declined by 100 percentage point mark from 142% to 42% in 2020-21, it just shows that that has played out and can play out. And this can further underreporting as women will be discouraged from reporting instances of violence against them. It is a cyclical process. In fact, our study aligns with existing debates for the need of such crisis centers in public spaces. Existence of crisis centers like One Stop Center and Shakti Sadan can aid the creation of gender transformative public spaces in the country. And lastly, and this is born out of our limitations as well, is that there is an urgent need to understand how these facilities operate at the grassroots. As we know, patriarchy can also pervade existing formal channels of redressal of violence against women. With that, I will end the presentation. Thank you so much for your patience.
So this is a presentation by Krishna, and she'll be presenting on the work that they have done with respect to recording experiences of women, of girls and women in rural spaces, which I think sometimes is an understudied area when we engage with public spaces.
So I'll just briefly talk about SWATI. SWATI, I'll be referring to my notes so I can cover most of it. SWATI is an organization which started in 1994 with an initiative of working with women on health sectors concerning to gender-based violence, and they had initiated a rural women's movement, wherein the movement was for the woman, by the woman, and of the woman, and it involved developing women's leadership. We co-started working with 6 community initiatives, and we have 2 pilot initiatives. So while we were in the phase of working in 2021, we tried researching our data on understanding violence that is happening in rural spaces, and while we were searching, we realized that there is no data which is available in rural spaces. The only data that is available, the systematic data, was only for the urban spaces, the sexual violence that occurs in amongst women and girls in India. And it is, I mean, the last data that was available was in NHFS 4, with a comparison of 5.9 to 9.6 in rural women and girls in India for sexual violence. So we started with this project called No Fear. You can very well see it's a pun, that to have no fear, you should know your fear. So the project is implemented in 2 districts of Gujarat, Patadi and Mahisagar, and it fosters the freedom from violence and safety for women and girls in public spaces. The project aims to mobilize to claim the demands of women and girls through citizenship rights and local, good governance, while getting them connected to panchayats, and prioritize and respond to women and girls facing violence. So the study that I'm going to present is going to be data that was collected in collaboration with GIDR and SWATI in 2021, and the paper is descriptive. It is not a comparison analysis between both the blocks. We have been trying to capture the public space violence that is happening to adolescent girls in these both the villages, and it is a multi-phase selection sample where the total sample size is 527, and intervention is done through empowerment data on the determinants, if at all at later, if the data is available or not. So the methodology that we adopted was, we had 26 project villages, and 17 villages were from Santrampur, and 9 villages, Santrampur, that is Mahisagar district, and 9 villages from Patadi, that is Surendranagar district. The data was collected randomly. It was the CAPI tool was used, that is computer assisted personal interviewing tool. As I said, the sample size was 527. Patadi had 186 adolescent girls, and Santrampur had 341 girls from age limit of 14 to 19 years. So we tried understanding how it has started. So how they are actually limiting themselves of not going to, why they are not going for the further education. So we realized that around 39% in Patadi and 20% in Santrampur were not going to school due to the fear of concerns and safety issues, as well as they were not interested in studies. Going further, the reasons behind dropping out was I'm not sure if you can read the data, but I'll read it. 13% of girls said that they had concerns for safety, and 35% of girls said that they were not interested in studies. While they were saying this thing, not interested in studies, somewhere down the line, they did have the concern of stepping out of the village, because the schools after 8th standard, the primary education is available in the school, but going beyond 8th standard, one needs to travel a lot outside the houses, outside the villages. So the schools are 15 kilometers away, public transport is not available, the places are deserted. So these were some of the hidden reasons that they were not able to show their concern at that point of time. So while we were trying to understand that if at all violence had occurred with them, so at least 38% had experienced at least one sort of sexual violence in their villages actually. And it was reported to the police station, but from this there were even chances that the FIR were not lodged in these cases. Then the types of sexual violence that they had experienced, the majority of the adolescent girls had answered that 66% of them had experienced staring and 31% of them had been experiencing verbal abuse. So perception about being unsafe, it is very interesting to know actually. They said that 51% of the girls were scared to go in fairs because they were afraid of getting abused. But they have also said that 43% were scared to go to cinemas. But when we actually asked them that do you even go to cinemas, and they were like, no, but we feel that it is unsafe because there are larger groups of men present over there. So that is the main thing, that it is their perception, like they feel that this is unsafe rather than, and that's why they avoid going to this place and marking them as unsafe actually. So here comes the geography of violence. The geography of violence, when it's mostly in the market space that they experience a lot of violence. That is 24% is verbal abuse. Then 40%. I mean, somebody even so this data was captured by their personal interview while they were using the tablet. They were using the tablet and filling in the data, so they felt more comfortable in expressing themselves. And while we were asking the questions, they did not open up. But while we asked the questions on the tablet, flashing was one of the major reasons that they were afraid moving onto the roads for. They were scared because they were facing such kind of sexual violence in the village premises too. Adolescent girls' reason for believing public space was unsafe. One of the major reasons was that men loiter around. Like, because men are loitering around, they feel quite unsafe. And another reason, like Sarojini ma'am also said, that infrastructure, like travel infrastructure, like street light. I mean, those spaces are such that I don't think, except for highways, they have even a street lighting over there. So it is a very deserted road. It is a very dangerous road. I mean, women are not welcomed at many places. So there is this chauraya. There is a circle where only men can sit. If a woman comes over there, so it's like it becomes a talking point that why is she sitting over there. So it's like the public spaces are hidden. I mean, the places which are hidden from the public areas also, they feel unsafe about it. Types of sexual harassment and the perpetrators and they were facing was 76%. So 76% strangers showed that they were staring, and most of it you can see that it is the perpetrators are the strangers actually who have been abusing the adolescent girls, for which they get scared to step out of their villages. So the neighbor, in some places the neighbors are also the people who abuse the girls. So this is one interesting fact, like the girl Swati had started bus service for school going girls because they had dropped out, and it so happened that the person in the bus itself abused the girl. So the whole village stopped the idea of going to further education, and all the girls dropped out of the village. So when we are trying to make such interventions for the girls, it happens that it creates a lot of problem for them only to go further with certain interventions. so who perpetrates in the public spaces? It's like most of it is the strangers, like 70% it is staring, verbal abuse again 70%, and stalking is 61%. So the highest amount of abuse is done by strangers. And what would be the response to the violence? Like when we asked the girls that what do you do, the most common answer that we got was they leave the place. They do not report. They leave the place, and this is common in both the spaces, Patadi and Maisagar, that they did not feel safe, and also they were worried to go back and tell their parents because their mobility would have been restricted. So they don't report, they don't speak about it, and they don't think that any further interventions are required in such kind of scenarios. So what are the, I mean, the conclusion is the conclusion in the recommendations are that people are not even aware about being sexually violated. I mean, the girls are not aware about being sexually violated, and I think we need to break the culture of silence over here and talk about it more. Then the school, especially, it affects the school. I mean, the girls who are going to the school who want to pursue higher education, they are feeling oppressed and they don't continue their schooling because of the abuse that they are facing actually. So getting back into a formal system, like where they can feel safe, where they can go ahead with schooling again, some kind of a formal policy which can be taken care of within the. So Rajasthan Gram Panchayats have started with girl-friendly panchayat. It is shaping up to certain extent, and certain villages are showing progress, but that kind of a model needs to get replicated everywhere actually. It is for Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao Andolan, but such kind of programs do not get visibilized in this kind of spaces. So I think if they are encouraged more, if they are replicated in some other states and everything, it makes a lot of difference. Then second thing is like after this research, we started engaging girls into certain kind of activities which involve physical and mental awareness. Like for example, sports. We started with kabaddi is one of the national sports. So they can have the platform where they can showcase their talent. And these girls have participated at district level, they have participated at state level, and they have created their own identity. And we also have realized that creating community influencers in the village creates a lot of talking points for the adolescent girls, where they come to speak to that woman and they feel safe to discuss their problems and everything. So I think a community leader, a woman leader, or a community influencer works quite well. And lastly, the most important thing, I think government needs to improve on safety measures, like what we said, like the infrastructure, like even the roads are not proper, even the transport facilities, like to get a transport you have to walk 15 kilometers outside the village. So which woman is going to feel safe about it? And there are no street lights, like after 6 o'clock there is hardly something visible over there. So and they need to raise these concerns. So if till they don't raise these concerns, that awareness needs to get created. So that is what I think is something that needs to be done everywhere. And plus I think the research data on rural public space violence needs to be highlighted a lot, because it doesn't exist. It is very rare on the internet. So more research needs to be done on that lines.
And those of you who would like to sort of talk to her more further with respect to the sports initiative, because Swati's initiative with Kabaddi has actually we've been on the ground looking at some of the girls who are influenced by, who have been part of the Kabaddi tournaments, and the results are quite interesting, and the kinds of conversations that they're having around, we all know about girls in sports and how that actually really helps, not just with claiming of public spaces, which is one thing, but also claiming of certain forms of identity, and how girls are using really innovative strategies to be able to participate, to kind of push back against social norms and mores. So if anyone wants to kind of follow up on the kind of work that Swati is doing with Kabaddi, I would encourage you to kind of talk to her. She's here for the next 2 days. It's quite interesting work, and we've been sort of first witnesses to it, so that's actually our privilege as well. Next is Mansi Singh, who will be talking to us actually from the, I think something quite significant in terms of also something that Sarojini has been, had addressed in her presentation, with respect to what does the state, how the state perceives gender identity. And what I really found, which I've kind of also spoken to her or written to her about, is that the state, I mean, although she's engaged with primarily the transgender identity, which is, I think, also very significant also because it's understudied and not really well known, but also it provides us an insight into how state engages with gender identity in general, right? So how do we, because it provides us also a kind of a reflection on how we see sort of the way in which gender identity is formed and framed, and what forms of sexuality is associated with certain kinds of normalization and certain forms of invisibilization of privilege more than anything else, right? So the hypervisibilization as well is something that can also be discriminatory in some form, something that she will highlight in her presentation. So over to you, Mansi.
Hello everyone, I am Mansi Singh. I'm the Senior Research Associate at the Center for Law and Policy Research. I work on policy and legal research on gender rights with a focus on trans rights, caste and disability rights, and on the issues of equality and non-discrimination with a focus on intersectionality. Through my master's dissertation and my work at CLPR for the past 2.5 years, I've engaged deeply with the legal framework on the rights of transgender persons. I've also learned immensely from my colleagues, clients, and collaborators who identify as trans or gender non-conforming folks. With that introduction about myself, I will now move on to the presentation. This is not based on a study like some of my co-panelists here. This is based on a lot of work that we do as part of litigation, and seeing how laws affect trans persons. And I've tried to keep myself very limited to the public spaces, livelihoods with 2 modes of income in particular, so that I dive deep and properly into it, as opposed to casting my net wide and not being able to cover things with the nuances. So through this paper, I've attempted to look at the legal framework that regulates the rights of gender and sexual minorities. As we know, trans people and gender variant persons face discrimination and exclusion in most spaces, but it's in public avenues such as the roads, parks, public transport, toilets, that this discrimination, this visibility, and the abuse is most heightened. In some part due to societal perceptions of the professions that they most commonly engage in, such as arms collection like Badai and Mangti, and sex work, and in some part due to state policies. These avenues have been historically unsafe, while also being very crucial for survival of the trans persons. These spaces and the policies can demonstrate violent power dynamics between the state and society on one hand and gender minorities on the other. I first look at the livelihoods that they engage in, then the judicial pronouncements on the rights of gender and sexual minorities. I look at the vocabulary against the post-colonial view that this vocabulary uses, the laws, the language of the law, how the laws can be used to abuse the gender variant persons in public spaces, and the implications it has on these persons. Okay, context. Everyone here has already seen, trans persons at streetlights, or maybe at a wedding, or when a newborn is being celebrated at home, and we see the marginalization of how we mete out the treatments to them. This becomes very heightened when it comes to the state authorities or law enforcement agencies such as the police. There's stigma, but also multiple forms of violence, ranging from sexual to economic to physical. Coming to the historical exclusion, it has meant that there are very few forms of trade and livelihood that have been left to trans persons, which now have been limited, I mean, at least in the informal spaces, are limited to begging, sex work, or collecting money. When we look at sex work, for instance, it is a major source of livelihood for many trans persons. As there appears to be a demand for sex with hijra, many have adapted to it in order to earn a living. This is all based on Serena Namda's ethnographic work on the hijra lives. There was a book out in 1999 and then again in 2005. There are many challenges, of course, to unregulated sex work. So for instance, many sex workers do not have control over their working conditions. They cannot dictate rates, hours, or place, have limited decision making when it comes to the use of condoms, and thus are highly vulnerable to sexually transmitted diseases, infections, HIV and AIDS. Moreover, they often face abuse and harassment from police, pimps, and goons. Now, there are two things to consider when it comes to trans sex workers. Firstly, the visibility of transness and gender nonconformity, both in their biological selves and then their expressions of gender. So sartorially, through their expressions, through their mannerisms, marks them as easy prey for harassment. Second, many trans persons end up leaving their abusive homes because, unlike the other queer groups who can pass off as straight in society, a trans person cannot. And if their home or family ends up being abusive, they have to leave that house. So trans persons, especially from the poorer socioeconomic backgrounds, actually lack the support of their families and social networks, which then makes them more vulnerable to this kind of harassment, this violence and brutality compared to the female sex workers and to the other queer groups that may be cisgender. Other common modes of income for some of the trans identities, not all of them, such as the hijra, include badhai and mangti. These are alms collections that are done in lieu of performing rituals of blessings, songs and dances at auspicious occasions such as weddings and childbirth, but also spill over to the public spaces as begging at traffic lights, market areas, and public parks. During these collections, trans persons may call out loudly to passers-by, to the vendors in the vicinity, be openly heteronormative through their voices, appearance, expressions, manner of dressings. And these are important to note as I come to the second section of the paper, which looks at how the law offers little protection against this kind of non-heteronormative expressions of self, and may in fact be twisted to harass trans persons in public spaces. Coming to the judicial, I'm very quickly going to take you through the judicial advancements because this is a very rights-based approach that I'm taking towards trans persons in public spaces. These three judgments that I look at actually upheld the rights of trans persons and other sexual minorities to live with dignity, privacy, and expanded the grounds for non-discrimination to sexual orientation and gender identity. The first one is the landmark judgment Nalsa in 2014, which recognized gender identity as one of the most fundamental aspects of an individual's life and upheld that all persons have the right to self-identify their gender. Further, it identified different trans groups as, Kotis, Hijras, Aravanis. They can identify as third gender without medical intervention. Further, it stated that non-recognition of this identity actually denies them equal protection, and makes them especially vulnerable in public spaces to harassment, violence, and sexual assault. This is important because the Supreme Court is taking cognizance of how they are being treated in public spaces, especially by the state agencies themselves. In Justice K.S. Puttaswamy versus Union of India 2017, privacy was held as an inviolable attribute of human dignity, and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation was stated as deeply offensive to dignity and self-worth. So it expanded the notion of what is a ground for discrimination in this country and included sexual orientation as part of that. Then Navtej Singh Johar and others versus Union of India in 2018 partially read down Section 377 and decriminalized same-sex relations between consenting adults. It also expanded the meaning of sex under Article 15 of the Constitution to gender identity and sexual orientation. This is also very important because now a Supreme Court judgment such as this actually then paves way for the people's movement to take the demands and the rights-based approach forward. Coming to the vocabulary of some of these, some of these judgments, Section 377 of the IPC actually uses the phrase carnal intercourse against the order of nature to ban the same-sex relations. Now, Navtej actually challenged it, stating that the determination of the order of nature is not a constant phenomenon. Social morality also changes from age to age. This is the opinion of the judges while giving this judgment. They prioritized the dignity and growth of the LGBTQI persons over the continuing social outlook that has been derived from a different age. When we come to the laws, we'll see why they are talking about a different age here. This is an important part where I want to note that the approach of the state has been more accommodating of the trans rights over the other LGBTQI groups. For example, with the Navtej judgment, the court did not take a strong stand on the rights of same-sex couples and left the repeal of the Section 377 to the legislature. On the other hand, central government continues to oppose the legalization of same-sex relations while heeding the court's directions in the Nalsa judgment. This is a member of parliament who has said this during the debate over the rights of transgender bills. This was an earlier draft of the bill that finally became the Transgender Act in 2019, and this is a policymaker who is saying that transgender is by nature and born that way, and he differentiates it from unnatural sex. So while one is a natural being, the other is promoting something unnatural, and that's why this kind of distinction happens between the trans groups and the other queer groups. There is also the association of many trans identities with spirituality and religion. A lot of trans identities actually have associations with Lord Shiva as being Ardha Nari, and others like Aravani and Jogappa who feel very connected to Lord Shiva in some way. So the visible, that is the bodily manifestation of the non-binary gender, is grudgingly accepted, while the invisible, which is the sexual orientation, is concealed under the socio-legal morality that we see here. Okay, I come to the legal framework, starting with 377, which we all know, which was titled Unnatural Offences. Then comes the Criminal Tribes Act 1871. Now this British colonial rule actually classified several tribes, including eunuchs in quotes, because that was the word that was used, as habitual criminals who by virtue of their birth are predisposed to committing crimes. And then Section 26 of the Act actually empowered the police to arrest without warrant any eunuch who dressed as a woman or wore ornaments or danced or played music with the intention of being seen from a public place or street. You see how this is 1871. This wasn't repealed until much later, and I will show you how this continues in some other laws still. If this is the language that is being used as the law, which makes things legal as opposed to what is illegal, then we can see how it also affects the perceived notions of trans people when it comes to the law enforcement agencies. When we look at the Telangana Eunuch Act 1919, it replicates these definitions and provisions of the Criminal Tribes Act, and it continues these registers of eunuchs. The Section 7 actually of this act, I mean, there's suspicion, they can be arrested on suspicion of kidnapping or emasculating young boys. Section 5 in fact penalizes any eunuch that may be found with the young boys. Section 7 is the most incriminating in this language. It states that any person found to be emasculating themselves or another or abetting emasculation will be punished with imprisonment. Now, why this is important? In a petition that has challenged this act in the Hyderabad High Court, it has been argued that under this act, under this section in fact, police and state authorities are often found arresting trans persons in cases where they're found just merely singing, dancing, cross-dressing in public spaces, which are taken as emasculation of themselves. This language actually criminalizes trans persons on the basis of their mannerisms, their modes of income, sartorial senses, so on and so forth. Moving on to the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, ITPA 1957. It was amended in 1986 to include a gender-neutral language, and its enforcement is primarily targeted to at the person soliciting sex in public and can often be used by police and thugs for violence and extortion against trans persons. So as you see, sections 3 to 8 actually focus on procuring, on anyone procuring, soliciting, or seducing a person for prostitution, and section 7 penalizes prostitution in the vicinity of public spaces. Now, when it comes to section 8, it uses very vague language such as willful exposure of person, tempts or endeavors to tempt, loiters, causes annoyance to residents, offense public decency. These are all words that I've taken that are relevant to public spaces. Now, in this case, the modes of livelihood for trans persons, which are sex work and arms collection, can very easily be made out as an offense under this act, and it is by many law enforcement agencies, and makes them, and sometimes even no arrest can happen. Maybe they're just using it to extort money from trans persons, just loitering in public spaces. There are some cases that I have here that actually have used this section for registering under this act. Then we finally come to the be-all of protection for trans persons. The Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019. This act, of course, gives the right to have self-perceived gender identity, and a trans person can now apply for an identity card stating their chosen name and gender, regardless of medical intervention. It prohibits discrimination and accessing any facilities and goods that are available to the general public. It states that very clearly. However, there are no provisions for reservations, as has been directed by the Supreme Court. This is very crucial because the Supreme Court did recognize them as socioeconomically backward classes that require reservations. It does not recognize the common modes of income that I have just listed out: sex work and begging or alms collection. And there is no regulatory framework for these workspaces that most trans persons engage in currently, which is public parks, streets, traffic lights. Abuse of trans sex workers, as I had pointed out earlier, is actually worse than female trans workers. I've already made that point. Yet, the Act actually punishes it with a lesser penalty. Section 18D penalizes physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal and emotional abuse, economic abuse, with 6 months to 2 years with fine. Now, comparing this to Section 376 of the IPC, which deals with the sexual abuse of a cis woman, that punishes the accused with a rigorous imprisonment of at least 10 years to life. And so by this act and the Section 376, you can see that it's starkly discriminatory and violative of the constitutional equality of a trans person and a cis person. And so what happens is the trans sex workers continue to remain as vulnerable to sexual and other abuses as ever, because this is not a solid deterrent. Second thing, now the concept of familiar space has been brought up a couple of times during this panel. What happens is when trans persons leave their own houses, a lot of them may join a gharana or a hijra household, which functions both as a residential unit and as an economic unit. Many hijras speak of the house as analogous to a family. What gharanas do is provide a roof over their heads, food, protection from police, strength in numbers in public spaces. That's very important. However, both the ITPA and Section 18C of the TPA, so Section 2C of the Trans Persons Act actually defines family as only the group of people that are related by blood or marriage or by adoption. That's often family is actually a site of abuse for many trans persons, as opposed to the family that they have chosen for themselves. Now, this neglect to include these social bonds as family, and on the other hand, under the ITPA, anyone who's accused of running a brothel, which a lot of Ijra Gharanas can often be accused of, in lieu of extortion of money or just, plain threatening, can potentially criminalize the Gharanas themselves. And so the Act continues to keep the trans persons without familial support and shelter and vulnerable to state harassment. The conclusion is, I was trying to show you how the poor understanding of the state, of the trans persons by state, actually leads them to little to no protection from the legal provisions or law enforcement agencies. neither the legal provisions nor the law enforcement agencies succeed in protecting trans persons in public spaces or otherwise. Many fighting for the trans rights believe that the emphasis on means of livelihood of trans persons is crucial to the integration to the mainstream social order. Others have pushed for reservations, in the fields of education and public employment as directed by NALSA. Yet others are pushing for horizontal reservations. There's an ongoing petition in the Supreme Court that takes cognizance of the intersectional identities of the gender of trans persons along with their caste, disability and other identities. And these movements are slowly gaining hold in the academic, public and legal discourses. There's also a petition that's ongoing for the inclusive accommodation of trans students in higher educational institutions. That's Trinetra's case. And most recently, of course, there's a petition for the same-sex marriage in which trans persons have also filed their own petitions. So, when we are talking about rights-based approach, we find that when the law itself does not understand you or is used to is used as a weapon against you, one of the few avenues is to have a rights-based approach through the courts, which have, as I showed through the judicial pronouncements, which have taken a more understanding view of trans identities and given rights that were then used to enact laws and push for the people's movements and push for demands in the people's movements. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Mansi, I think that was actually quite significant given, the nature of what kind of legal discourse kind of binds you to certain forms of one identity, what the state thinks is your identity. Especially, I think I like the idea of exploding the category of family and what that means. On to Raghavi and Tanushka. This paper actually has been written by 3 people, but 2 will be presenting. Amukta is grandly sitting over there, but I think she will also, answer questions when and if it comes. So over to you. You have about 20 minutes.
A very good evening to one and all. I am Tanushka and this is my colleague Raghavi, who we've co-authored with, and Nivi has already mentioned about Amukta. So our topic for today's session is familiar publics and public places and how women navigate public spaces with relation to familiar publics. So one of the projects at CBPS is Gender Violence in Public Spaces, studying the approaches and theorizing the pathways of change, where we are actually trying to understand the process and mechanics of social change. The primary focus is basically to find out or to explore the creation of safe spaces within public spaces. So for this purpose, we have collaborated with 3 organizations across 3 states. So we have collaborated with Bhumika Women's Collective, which is working for promotion of violence-free lives for women in the states of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Then we are working with Dusra Dashak in Rajasthan, which is committed to creating change makers within the local communities through their unique ecological program that provides education to marginalized communities in the various blocks of Rajasthan. And then we have also collaborated with SWATI in Gujarat, which is Society for Women's Action and Training Initiative, which started as a community-based organization, but now it basically is committed to initiating mass-based women movements in rural areas of Gujarat. So we have been working in the rural areas, many rural areas, and so the primary, what we have tried is that we have followed the qualitative methodology, where the primary focus for data collection has been embedded ethnography, which has been carried out in the state of Rajasthan and Telangana. And using ethnography, we have not only studied the pathways of the organizational strategies, but we have also recorded the lived experiences of women and adolescent girls by collecting village level data through participation observation, embedded ethnography, village mapping, informal interactions, and oral narratives. So we have worked with women, adolescents and men mostly from SC, ST and backward communities of the rural and the urban field. So over the course of 3 years, we've not only mapped the activities and strategies of these 3 organizations working towards social change, but we have also studied the living conditions, working environment, and women's experience with public places. And in the process, we have received immense insight about their inner lives and how they deal with violence, how they access and assert their presence in public and private places, and their perception on politics, marriage, and other issues like domestic violence, education, child marriage, and etc. So in the process of research, as we were engaging with the women, they have shared experiences, lot of experiences with us. And throughout the presentation, we'd like to use those examples and illustrations to make the concept, to help in understanding the concept better. So to begin with, one such experience is of a field mobilizer in one of the fields. Her name is Kamla. She's a 34-year-old woman who had to frequently access urban community, which is referred to as Basti. And basically her work was that she had to mobilize the community there. She had to create friendly relations with the people who were there in that Basti. And she was basically the face of the organization, and she had to report to the organization about the ground realities of the Basti. So one day, and also, you know, Kamla used to interact with a lot of people there. So she had to access narrow streets. There were places, you know, where people were there who knew her and some who didn't knew her. So one fine day, Kamla had to visit one of the bastis where she had to set up a free tailoring workshop for the women. And so she was basically looking for a center, and she was unable to find that center in that basti. So she kept looking for this center, and she felt helpless. So she moved out of the basti, and there was a street vendor who was standing there. So in need, she asked the street vendor if she could help Kamala. To Kamala's surprise, the street vendor already knew what work Kamala did and why she accessed the field and what she was doing. And you know, she basically helped Kamala find the center. So in similar experiences, when we were talking about not in similar experiences, but when we were talking about such experiences in team meetings, so we thought, you know, we as embedded ethnographers, I and Raghavi, recollected our experiences with the strangers that we had in public places. So one such incident is of mine. So I was based in Rajasthan, and I had to access the outskirts of Jaipur, where I was basically going to Bassi block, and there were a lot of villages which were far from the main city. So I had to frequently access that place, and one day I was waiting for a bus that went to supposedly village A. And I was waiting there, and suddenly a bus conductor comes to me and says, will you be visiting village B? And I just stood there and I said no, and I refused, and I just politely refused, and I stood there. And then that said, why? You always visit village B, why are you not going there? And to my surprise, I was like, have I done something so noticeable that he knew my travel routine? How does he know my travel pattern? I mean, what is it that has made him notice me? Should I just change my travel pattern? So during team meetings, sorry, there's one more thing. This is my experience. Raghavi's experience was completely different. So we were talking about this, and she comes up to me and she says that, you know, you're not the only one who's being recognized by the bus conductor. A bus conductor has recognized me also, but to my favor, they stopped the bus for me because I was running late. They knew that I was going to a certain place, but they stopped for me. But I'm very happy, you know. I was scared. I was sharing that experience with her, and she was happy that, you know, it was a nice gesture that she felt. So during team meetings, we couldn't help but notice, you know, certain people who are actually recognizing our movement and women's movement. And you know, we actually started discussing about these things with our advisor, and that's when our advisor actually introduced us to our advisor Nivedita Menon actually introduced us to the concept of familiar publics. So familiar publics are different from the strangers because we repeatedly encounter the familiar public in public places which one accesses frequently. The familiar publics are a subset of a general public that has engagement with us that allows us to navigate in public places. So this discussion actually pegged our interest, and this was something we and women were constantly encountering with. So, and we actually didn't have the name to refer to it. We didn't know who they actually were. So we thought of exploring familiar public as concept, as people, and as phenomena. So like I mentioned, familiar publics are different from strangers because unlike the strangers, there is a certain level of engagement and relationship that we establish with the familiar public. They are a subset of general public that we encountered repeatedly and are bound to us by a certain level of social reciprocity. So the nature of familiar public is such that they are ephemeral and tenuous. And to explain this, I again have a very nice example to tell. in Rajasthan, I had to access one of the villages, which was referred to as Dhanau, and it was some 24 kilometers from Bassi, and Bassi itself was like 20 kilometers from the main city, Jaipur. So while I was traveling in the bus, I noticed that there were a certain group of women who used to daily access Dhanau in the bus, and there is a lot of the frequency of buses from main city Jaipur to Dhanau is just very limited. So the women had no other option. If they didn't board that bus at the right time, the only bus available from Dhanau was late in night, so they didn't have any option. They had to board it. But instead, what the women did was that they actually exchanged their contact number with the bus conductor who was there, so that the bus conductor could actually tell them the time and if the bus was getting delayed due to any reasons, and whether the bus was coming to the stops at the right time, right place or not. So in this case, what happened is women have built acquaintances with the conductor to be able to access buses at the right time and place. What happened in this case is that the conductor, who was once a stranger, has now transitioned into familiar public, providing them the key information regarding their only mode of travel. Therefore, the bus conductor do not become completely known or friends to these women. Rather, both the conductor and women are bound by a circle of social reciprocity. Both the conductor and because the conductor encounters them daily, and he knows that they are his daily passenger, he too forms a hidden connection to these women. Moreover, these buses are crowded, chaotic and suffocating, and trust me, it is. I have travelled in these buses. So for women, the presence of their own familiar stranger helps them set a private boundary within the public space and act as their eyes in the public transport. So in this example, we can see that the experience of women with familiar public at first was that the women had no contact with the bus conductor. Over time, the familiarity increased. They started creating relations with the bus conductor to strategize their travel. This use of familiar publics to travel in the public's place is what we're calling as phenomena. But this phenomena might not be as pleasant as we are stating it, because it can be a complete opposite for others. Like Krishna mentioned in a slide as well, that first I'll give the example, then I'll give her reference. So again, in one of the fields, there was a girl named Alka. She's a 25-year-old, and she used to frequently commute to a place from a similar bus for work. And one such time, during interactions, she told us that she was so careful about how she's presenting femininity and respectability in that bus, because the bus conductor actually, if he does not find any girl in the best behavior, he basically passes on information about girls to the boys that are present in the bus. So she was so scared that the bus conductor will go and give this information about not being in the best behavior to the boys as well as to her brother. And so what she used to do is, for her, the best behavior included not putting lipstick and coal. So she was constantly afraid of the fact that the bus conductor was surveilling her, and because she's doubtful that he would complain to her brother, she had to be in her best behavior, and she absolutely had limited engagement to our, that's what we noticed, that she had no engagement with the bus conductor, very limited engagement with the bus conductor. And that's where we thought that the perception about the person actually forms the perception about the public place that you're there in. Like Krishna also mentioned about that gangs who were there, and how the girls did not wanted to go to the melas or fairs primarily because there was the presence of gangs that were there. So the perception about that gang also kind of made the perception about that place. So with all these experiences, we have learned that there are certain characteristics that help articulate familiar publics, like repetitive interaction in a specific public place, recognition and acquaintance from limited engagement, relations created by women with familiar publics, and the reciprocity that they share.
So, in the process of understanding familiar publics, we have also looked at the literature to see if we can find the phenomena there. So, we have studied what is called as familiar strangers, which was coined by Stanley Milgram. So familiar strangers are the people who have continuous presence in the public place. So in order to understand women's experience, we have also read Shilpa Phadke and other authors' work of a while later. And apart from that, we have also looked at the literature on the street vendors and the women and their experiences in the transport. So with this, what we observed is that the phenomena of familiar publics is mentioned very much in these discussions, but the name of familiar publics is not used. So what we did is we went on further with the experiences that we have collected from the field to define the factors that, to identify the factors that define these familiar publics. So as I said, we have been telling you beautiful stories and we have few more to tell. So these are the experiences that that the women in the field have and we as researchers had. So so the articulation of familiar publics that is derived from these experience encompasses the knowledge and the perception that we and the women share with the particular public place and the people in it. So let me make it clear by referring to the previous example that Tanushka was mentioning. So Kamala, who is field worker in one of the urban bastis, she accesses these 5 bastis for her work. So these bastis are actually the slums or migrant colonies formed by the people migrated to the city from nearby villages. So these are inhabited by the people who work in unorganized sector. What happens here is that these are also the people from communities such as SC, ST and BC, and we also find people from Muslim and Christian communities. So Kamala is very well aware of the places where she can conduct meetings, where she has to avoid. And these are the places that she avoids are the places where which have gangs of men in it. So like alluding to the points that were mentioned here again. So she constantly avoids these places, or she feels apprehensive in accessing the places that are not familiar to her. So what we want to tell with this point is that her relationship with the public place is defined by her experience, her knowledge of that place, her knowledge of the people who are inhabiting in that public place. Hence, her articulation of familiar publics is also dependent on the knowledge and the perception she has. Another important point that we should notice in Kamala's case is that how design of a public place can actually lead to formation of familiar publics. For example, Kamala, the streets that Kamala accesses are sometimes narrow, deserted, poorly lit. So she oftentimes expressed to us that she is comfortable in accessing the places that have familiar places. So, but there are few places in the basti which were cleared in the name of slum development projects, and vertical colonies of apartments were built. Since these places are cramped of space and there are no presence of, so there is a limited presence of people there, she is not so confident in accessing these places. So what we want to say is the spacious roads, the footpaths, however broken they may be, or the domestic rest places, domestic extensions like rest places in the streets are the ones that facilitate presence of people in public space. If street vendors set up their businesses, this allows the presence of more and more people in the public place, hence increases the diversity of people accessing that place, hence also makes the women comfortable in accessing those spaces. As mentioned earlier, familiar publics is a subset of larger general publics. So the questions that Tanushka experienced when she was identified by the bus conductors are noteworthy. Among all the travelers, why was she noticed? Why was her travel pattern noticeable? Was it because of her appearance, or is it because of the urban demeanor that she carries around, or is it because of the denims that she was wearing? The bus conductor could also be observing other women. So we wanted to understand what are the aspects that made few people visible to others, and what are the characteristics that form this engagement. So what are the aspects that form this engagement? So the social context that the women are coming from, like gender, class, caste, this could be anything. I'll tell you one example, one story of a Bina who is she's a street vendor in front of a school. So she actively monitors the behavior of students who are accessing the space in front of her shop for immoral activities like engaging in romantic relationships, because for her it is moral responsibility to stop such acts. So what she told, and she also performs other functions. So if a girl is waiting for someone to be for her parents to be picked her up, Bina actually provides shelter to that girl until, safe shelter to that girl until she is picked up by her brother or someone. At the same time, she also shoos away men and boys from her shop, thinking that those men are also there to, form the relationship with the girls. So Bina's attitude are dependent on the gender, class, and caste that the people who are accessing this public place come from. So the point here we would like to mention is that the social context of the actors is what it is defining the familiar public's action towards these people. So like I was mentioning, larger public provides anonymity to the people, whereas familiar publics blur this anonymity. Anonymity is tied to feeling of safe or unsafe. When one is anonymous, there is a tendency either to feel safe or unsafe. So FP blurs this anonymity. So when it blurs the anonymity, it helps the women in negotiating the public places through perceived safety. When we encounter familiar place in a public place, we perceive certain level of safety. In Alka's case, the bus conductor can either be a surveillant or be a protective of her. Blurring of anonymity is allowing this surveillance or protection to happen. When there is awareness on certain levels of danger that she might encounter in a public place, Alka might feel protective of bus conductor's behavior, but in this case she is actually feeling surveillant because he was constantly policing the actions of girls who are accessing this space. The perception of surveillance or protection also depends on the levels of trust built between the people and familiar public. For example, the women who from Danau, as we have explained earlier, have showed some level of trust towards conductors by sharing their personal contact details, whereas in case of Tanushka, there is such trust is not visible. Fearing more surveillance from him, she had to change her entire travel pattern. As discussed earlier, as discussed in Why Loiter, women tend to feel more surveillanced in their own neighborhoods, so because there is less anonymity. In case of familiar publics too, because of this less anonymity, they tend to feel more surveillanced, and this oftentimes is reflected as is shared with us as moral policing, because what is seen as moral responsibility by Bina is seen as moral policing by the women who are experiencing it, because there is constant policing of actions. Yes, it is. So in conclusion, so in conclusion, there is actually no conclusion, because we can't say if there are because we cannot say if they are safe. So women or we cannot actually say if they are safe or unsafe. It is entirely based on the perception. It is based on the social context from which the women are coming. It is based on the nature of the public place itself. So some might use familiar publics to strategize their mobility, whereas some might actually avoid them, fearing more surveillance. So these are the questions that are there in front of us.
So I'd like to invite Sarojini to kind of moderate the next sort of discussion section. I would like to sort of open it. We have 15 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think very diverse presentations, two which actually looked at the way the state provided for or responded to issues. Yours about the OSC and the huge budget gaps, and yours about the gaps in the legal definitions and in the implementation, and two studies which were far more ethnographic and actually looked how things actually play out in the space. I have 2 or 3 comments which you can answer at the end, but I thought while they're still fresh in my head, I would just put them on the table before I open the floor. One is that, starting with the last presentation first, because it's freshest in my head, is that, first of all, I think this concept is interesting. Of course, I find personally it will take time for me to absorb the word familiar publics, because I think of publics, the public face. So I'm just thinking, I know the other terminology used in other papers, while, other people has been familiar strangers. I don't know how, but that's something that really hit me. But I honestly think that in the case of this familiar public in the framework of, it's important to also somewhere, whenever we look at issues, and we've been talking about women, it's also to understand how familiar publics, to use the word, also mediate relationships which may not always be related to with men, because it's not, it's not as if when you're somehow, there is a relationship where familiarity breeds even with men in a certain area. And I think it's important to always see, I feel, women in relation to what's happening to men in terms of when you're looking at outcomes or education or whatever, because if you just see it isolated, you don't get that comparative sort of thing. The second thing I want to say is, like your own case where you said this happened, maybe he was just asking an innocuous question. So I think this whole issue of question we need to ask ourselves is how much enhancement of confidence and thing do we also need for women to face public spaces, because I think I know when people, they can face. So that was my one question. I think when I come back to this issue about the about the budget allocation, I think there's no question, because I'll leave it open. I think that methodology really works. But my question there is, how are you doing advocacy for that data? And when it comes to the issue about the legal framework, I think it really presents a very good example of what I call political haze. Trying to give the impression of actually meeting the rights, but when you read between the lines, there's a lot of blurring and confusion. So I'll leave it at that, open the floor, and then maybe you can answer later. So who would like to ask? And please do indicate who you want to address the question to.
So mine is actually, I'll borrow from what Mansi you mentioned about legal vocabulary failing to address ground reality, and pose a question for Tanya. So when you speak, so when we talk about domestic violence, often tenure security is taken away from victim, but the way eviction is read even today, domestic violence victims aren't considered evicted because there's no landlord kicking them out. Legally, it's still voluntarily leaving house. So there's still this gap of how you lose your housing rights when you're a victim of domestic violence, but on the legal side, there's no recognition because the legality doesn't recognize the person having been evicted. And so what was your engagement with loss of housing and general legal haze around the whole matter of not recognizing this?
I think we should collect a few questions, and that will give time,
Hello, my name is Harita. One thing that about Mansi's presentation, when we were talking about trans persons, I felt most of it is related to male to female trans persons, right? I think it may be useful to remember that, because female to male gets invisibilized, and they are not involved in begging and all that. So so there is a patriarchy there also, where male body getting greater visibility. That's one. And the second thing is not so much about one presentation, but who gets invisibilized and what kind of perception of men and boys is underlying in these 4 presentations is what I was thinking. Because there is at one level creating awareness and making women question is definitely a step forward. At the same time, if you want transformatory change in gender relations, working with men and also kind of breaking a sort of monolithic image of boys and men and a dialogue around that is also important, and how it gets informed in this study and inquiry is a reflection, rather not really pointing to any other question.
Hi. So I have one comment and one question. So I'll raise my comment first. To Mansi's one, even with the latest Transgender Protection Act, it mentions identity card. And identity card, again, if you read through the policy, it again mentions you need to have a constant interaction with the bureaucracy, which includes sessions court people, government, medical college, so doctors and other health professionals and everyone, which still means you're not even with the idea of self-determination, which is trying to be promoted through an identity card. There is still a right of bureaucracy that goes through, where you have to declare at every stage, you can prove yourself against the state that, I identify as a trans person and these are my, quote unquote reasons to identify so. So that was the comment there. And to Krishna was, so when you talked about sexual violence and all of it, were you able to look into POXO cases that were reported in that area? Because you mentioned abuse from strangers, but if you go through the POXO cases and the kind of analysis that we're able to draw from the cases, there's a lot of family-based violences where most of the abuses are within the family. And in these cases, because data suggests strangers more, and the POXO case suggests that family members are the pain. So do you think this kind of dichotomy that came across was because of either the participants or your respondents were not able to publicly talk about it or discuss about it, or do we think, like, are we, when researchers are researching on these, we missing out on something there?
Okay, I think we'll stop taking. Okay, last question.
My question is to Krishna. According to your findings, 20% of children data, 20% were not facing any kind of abuse. Are there among the 28% belongs to SC or ST or what kind or others?
So question to me was about how did I engage with the legalese on domestic violence particularly. We did not. We looked at violence in public spaces. Neither did we go into describing IPC crimes, because that was not the objective of the paper. So that is my short answer.
When you are asking about the POXO cases, there was a consideration of asking them, but really the girls were not left alone to answer. Like, even when they were filling in the tablet, somebody or the other was keeping a surveillance on them. So we tried, we tried a lot that they shouldn't be surrounded. In fact, even we did not want to be around them, but it never happened that they were kept alone. So they were more like talking about the strangers more rather than the people within the family itself or within the cluster itself, because such kind of cases happen in the cluster, like eve teasing, catcalling and all that also happens over there. So we have witnessed it, but they haven't spoken about it. So they don't report it actually. And about the SC/ST data, yes, we have. So the party block mostly is about the 86% is OBC, and the people who have reported that the 20% that they have not faced violence, sexual violence, 76% is the scheduled tribe from Sandrampur block, that is the Maisagar block. So the social composition is there. So the others are around 16%, but mostly it is SC, ST and OBC.
Thank you for your question. You had mentioned that causing women to leave household is not technically illegal. I was just looking at the DV Act to refresh my memory, because it is illegal. If anyone causes a woman to leave a shared household through means of distress or anything under Section 3D, it is penalized under the Domestic Violence Act. It is also an offence under the Trans Persons Act. If you cause a trans person to leave their household, this is actually incriminating for some of the gharanas or the gurus, in fact, because they may be charged under this section to say that, oh, you caused them to leave the to leave their household, and so it is in fact incriminating. But this is an important question, so thank you for raising that. So you are absolutely right. The Hijra identity, with the one that I actually brought out the most in my paper, is actually male to female transitioned bodies, and they are definitely more glaringly visible as compared to female to male transitions, and there is definitely that hierarchy. However, having said that, female to male transition bodies also have carry the weight of having lived in a female body for a long time. So that interaction with public spaces, as someone having previously interacted as a woman or a female in some biological sense, still remains. So that nuance is actually something that maybe I should try to bring out in my paper. So thank you for bringing that up. And ID cards. That was you again. Yeah, you're right that the bureaucracy is still there in a big way. However, the medical intervention that is required as part of applying for the TG card can also just include counseling. Now, most trans persons actually go through gender dysphoria, for which counseling is actually great, and which is actually covered under the Ayushman Bharat scheme now. So yes, you're right, the bureaucracy is still there in terms of like applying to the DM, who often rejects if they don't know the act or how to implement it. But in some ways, it's also great that they are getting counseling as part of medical interventions, which is required. Thank you.
We actually didn't have any question, but Sir was mentioning about including men and women, boys.
So I'll just say something very quickly, just to say, in India just now there's not, but one of the big debates that's going on, just to take on from you, is one thing is when you actually have a sex change and you go from being male to woman. But now the definition of gender, which is being vastly accepted, is that you just have to think that you're. So one of the big debates that's going on overseas is basically around the fact that you can think you are actually a male body, you haven't had a sex change, but you think you are a woman. The big debate I saw when I was going in England is, does that woman go into the women's cell in the prison, or does she or he, I don't know how to put it, does he use which toilet? And there was a big debate going on because there was also this debate of the other side, people are again dominating and they may be predators. So I'm just telling you that this is a very, very complex, we haven't got to that yet, but it is part of the debate thing. The other thing I just want to quickly say, because just to is that you see, when you're doing gender responsive budgeting, what you did, Tanya? Yeah, Tanya did, and she picked up just one scheme. I mean, and that's totally valid. What I'm trying to say is when you do gender responsive budgeting, you can choose a scheme, you can choose a sector, you can choose the whole government budget. So just finding out gaps, it can be done for absolutely anything. So I'm just saying that it's a totality in itself. You don't then look at the whole issue of violence against women. And the last thing I just want to say is that, and I did mention it in the slide, but this whole issue of involvement and bringing in men and boys, which you alluded to, I think is critical to the whole change of changing within institutions, because what you need is changing the way people think and do things. So I'll just stop.
We were also planning to explore what men and adolescent boys experience with familiar publics and how their perceptions of safety and safe and unsafe comes in. So that's the next thing to explore in our paper.
We have exciting high tea waiting for all of us. But I'd like to actually, because this is something that I've been working with in the last 3 years, we have worked on public spaces and definitions of public spaces for, now I'm sleeping, eating, reading, everything, public space. But so I really want to collect my thoughts together so that I also would like some conversations going forward to all of the people who are here, because I know there are a lot of people here who have been working primarily on public spaces and gender, and I'd like to have these conversations brought forward. One is, I think, basically from the first panel that we spoke about, there is a conversation that we need to have about when we have a perception of public space, there is, I think, also a post-truth, which I think Professor Varghese spoke about. There is a reality out there which I think is stranger than one believes in. For example, I'll tell another story. I'm sorry, I'll take 2 minutes. In Hyderabad, actually, Jyotsna and I had gone to a meeting, and while this meeting was being conducted, imagine the space, okay? So you have there's a mosque and there is a temple, which nowadays where do we find that? And there's a street there. It's two common streets, and there's the Basti. The Basti, you know, all of us who've been to Bastis know that there is no kind of wall, and then the house starts, right? The wall is the house, and then there's a what you call in Malayalam. There's a padi. So there is that step or a slab, correct? Now that's not really, you know, you would not consider that private space. But there was this woman who was there the entire meeting, this really loud, you know, like just children's meetings. You can imagine how loud it was, right? It's active, and there is like cows going, and the autos are going, and she is taking a pillow, and she came out of the house, she took a pillow, and she slept there, right? Slept on that slab, right at that space. Now, we have campaigns in Bangalore, you might know, where you take blankets out to parks and sleep in public places as a way of reclaiming that, right? So inviting risks, as Shilpa Phadke says. But the thing is that woman was doing that right there. She wasn't part of any campaign. She was in public space, and she was sleeping, and she was soundly sleeping. And I can tell you very honestly, I cannot do that outside my house. There's a whole social identity and a social class that is attached to that kind of space. So what I'm trying to say is that when we say about, okay, we have to claim social spaces and we have to claim public spaces, we are. Women are claiming public spaces, just not in the ways that we see them. And the violence is real, right? So you can see it. Like, you can see it in numbers, you can see it in stories, you can see it in any number of ways. At the same time, there are women who are engaging with this. They are inviting risk in their day-to-day lives, not necessarily because they want to, but they have to, but they also engage because they want to, because that's another thing that perhaps we might miss out in a conversation of public spaces, but was very definitely articulated in the first panel, is that public spaces are also of, and actually Sarojini also mentioned it, is of leisure, is of joy, is of pleasure. I mean, if you speak to all of us who've been working in public spaces, women seek public spaces for joy, for, you know, we enjoy being out. We enjoy the areas that we are. So one of the things is also a politics of joy, pleasure. I mean, when we talk about the legalese of it, that some of that can be, and claiming sexuality. So one of the comments that I had for Mansi was, you know, when sexuality is so openly contested in the transgendered body, it also what it does is it also erases our sexuality that we are unable to express, you know, cisgendered sexuality that we are unable to express, because the truth is that the public space is actually also a lens into our own social mores, right? It is, our performance in public spaces is actually telling the world who we are, and that could be our horrendous oppressive selves, right? That could be us. And that's, for us, I mean, what I'm asking is an invitation to examine public spaces is also an invitation to ask what we believe in, who we are, because what we perform in public spaces is really what our politics are, right? So when we do not claim buses at night, when we do not go in buses at night, when we self-police and come home at 9 p.m., we're also making other women much more vulnerable at the same time, right? So the action of making us safe is making others unsafe. And so that's a politics that we must embrace in some ways, right? That what we're performing is really talking about who we as a society, what we are representing. And so then the second thing then is about how money matters. And oh my God, Tanya, you must do this much more, we need to create accountability. And the thing is, apart from the critique that I actually had for your paper, around, you know, what's the sort of, you know, implications with respect to what one-stop centers, whether they are being used, blah, 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 there is an accountability and governance, that mechanism that actually must matter. And the third point, and I'll end with this, is really about, you know, I mean, I really like your point about, you know, not monolithic ideas. And I think the monolithic ideas can come from any place, right? So patriarchy not being a monolithic idea, men not being a monolithic idea, vulnerabilities not being a monolithic, violence not being a monolithic idea. So I think moving away from, one is to embrace intersectionality, as, you know, Sarojini has spoken about. The other is to engage with diversity, as one of the comments, you know, said. One is to engage with that. But also I think, as a researcher, I think it's just we don't have enough to say more, and I think that's really, we need data. We need data very badly. We don't have enough. And so I feel like it's also an invitation for all of us who are interested in public spaces, if we can come together in some form or fashion, because the government at the moment is not collecting, right? And someone said that we can't even trust some of it. So we need data, because I think for us, if I'm saying that our performance in public spaces is about who we are, our data is also reflecting about what we need, what it is that we absolutely need. And I'll go back to what Sarojini has been saying since the morning, is that we do not have an articulation of what women actually do and what women want. I think both of those things are critical, and I think in our daily experiences, what we do and what women want is something that we should keep front and center. And I thank you all for your patience and for listening patiently to all of our presentations, and thank you all for your comments. And please be in touch with us. We are here located, we are celebrating our 25th. Please be in touch with us if you're interested or want to work much more in gender and public spaces. Thank you.